the Indian Express Explained Live, our series of online explanatory conversations with domain experts and authorities on specific subjects. I am Monojit Majumdar, editor for explanatory journalism at the Indian Express. We are discussing this evening the relationship between India and the United States. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has just completed an official state visit to that country, during the course of which he addressed a joint sitting of Congress for a historic second time, and the two countries signed a series of agreements, the most consequential of which were in the defense and technology sectors. As the ties acquire a new and unprecedented momentum, some questions are moot. What is the nature of the strategic partnership between India and the US? What are its drivers and where is it headed? Earlier breakthroughs, such as the civil nuclear deal, have not delivered as much and as quickly as had been expected. So, what is the guarantee that the current round of agreements will not flatter to ultimately deceive? What are the challenges going forward, especially as India faces some questions from time to time with regard to the alleged issues with its human rights record and treatment of minorities? To answer some of these questions, we have with us here Ambassador Arun Singh, India's former ambassador to the United States and one of the keenest observers and most insightful analysts of the evolution of the bilateral relationship over the years. Ambassador Singh, welcome. Thank you for your time. We are delighted to have you here.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
You're special to the Indian Express, sir. We have been honored to be able to host you on this platform earlier. In December 2020, as President Joe Biden prepared to enter the White House, you explained to us with remarkable clarity and eloquence the key aspects of continuity and change in the bilateral relationship. We are so happy to welcome you back. Speaking to Ambassador Singh will be my colleague, Diplomatic Affairs Editor at the Indian Express, Shubhajit Roy. Shubho, you have reported for many years on India's foreign policy, and you have kept a very close eye on our relationship with the US. All of you can read all of Shubhajit's wonderful reporting, analysis, and commentary on our website, www.indianexpress.com. Today's Explained event is brought to you by our partner, Plutus IAS. My thanks to our partner. And thank you all for joining, and welcome once again. Shubho.
Thank you. Thank you, Monojit. It is indeed a privilege to host Mr. Singh for the second time, who was stationed in Washington, D.C. for 6 out of 8 years of the Obama-Biden administration. First as the Deputy Chief of Mission, and then as the ambassador, as the Indian ambassador to the U.S. I think it's fair to say that, outside the current Indian government, I think there is no one who has a deeper understanding of the Biden administration as Mr. Singh, as well as one who is able to explain the nuances of the India-US ties. Thank you, Mr. Singh, for joining us at this event.
Thank you, Shubhajit, and thank you for those very, very generous comments.
Yeah. So, today we are here to discuss the transformation in the India-US ties after this first official state visit by the Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and his address to the US Congress, which was for the second time he got the opportunity to address the Congress. In fact, the first Indian leader to do so amongst a handful of foreign leaders who've had the opportunity. Just to get back to this particular issue, Prime Minister Modi has said during this visit that his visit to the US has resulted in a great positive transformation. And the two countries, emerging from different circumstances and history, will together demonstrate that democracies matter and democracies deliver. And US President Joe Biden, in his remarks while he was framing his country's partnership with India, described it as the most consequential in the world, that is stronger, closer, and more dynamic than any time in history. Mr. Singh, you have had the privilege of being an insider to this transformation of the relationship. If you could take a, a few minutes to explain the context, the transformation that this particular relationship has seen in the last 2.5 decades. Mr. Singh.
Thank you, Shubhajit. And you've correctly said that the transformation has taken place over a little over 2 decades, because the most analysts have correctly pointed out that perhaps 2000 marked the year when the new phase began. And the context of that is that you will recall that in 1998, when we had done our nuclear tests, the US had severely criticized India and then led the world to impose financial and technology related sanctions on India. But after some time, I think he assessed that it was now the moment to have a different kind of relationship with India. India had shown certain capabilities, and India had also shown the strength to withstand the impact of sanctions, both financial and technological. So he mandated his Deputy Secretary of State, Stroke Talbot, who was very close to him. They had studied together in the UK, to pursue a very deep dive discussion with an Indian counterpart. And on the Indian side, then Prime Minister Mr. Vajpayee nominated Mr. Jaswant Singh, who later became India's foreign minister, defense minister, finance minister at different times. The two of them had a series of intense conversations over a period of 18 months. They met 14 times in 10 different countries. And there was very deep discussion on what our strategic challenges are, what our aspirations are, what could be the convergence between the two countries. And the first impact of that we saw was when Pakistan violated the line of control in Kargil in 1999. At that time, for the first time in nearly 50 years, the US took a firm position on the side of India, on an India-Pakistan issue, and clearly said that Pakistan had violated the line of control and needed to go back onto their side of the line of control. And that was what they pressed Nawaz Sharif also to do when he visited the US on 4th July 1999. So that was one indication. And then Clinton visited India in 2000, a very successful visit. Speaking in our parliament, he spoke very highly of India's strengths as a democracy, spoke of the two nations conceived in liberty and how much we could work together. It also began the process of de-hyphenation of India-Pakistan relations. So he spent about 5 days in India. On the way back, he stopped for a couple of hours in Pakistan and then carried on. Now, when his term finished, and he was a Democrat, then we had a Republican President, George Bush. And from all reports, George Bush told his administration that he wanted to advance the relationship with India and he wanted clear recommendations on how that could be done. And his administration came to the conclusion that to advance the relationship with India, technology-related restrictions needed to be removed. Because if they were not removed, then you couldn't have higher level cooperation in the economic domain, in dual-use technologies, or in defense. And so they came to the conclusion that to do that, they had to do a civil nuclear cooperation agreement with India. Unless you remove the restrictions on India related to civil nuclear technology, other restrictions couldn't be removed. So he pushed very hard and he took a lead. There was a lot of objection within his administration, in the Congress, in the policy community, in the non-proliferation lobby, but he pushed the administration to move forward to do the civil nuclear cooperation agreement with India. And not only did he push his own administration, he had to get international approval at the International Atomic Energy Agency, at the Nuclear Suppliers Group. So he organized all of that. And on the Indian side, of course, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh took the step that, yes, this was an important agreement for India. And if you recall, in 2008, he staked the survival of his government. There was a no confidence motion. So the two of them advanced that process. And in 2008, the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement was signed. Now, that agreement, at one level, as Manojit also mentioned, did not lead to nuclear trade between India and the US, but it ended the nuclear apartheid for India. But for that agreement, but for international approval for that agreement, no other partner of India could do nuclear cooperation with India. Even Russia couldn't supply more nuclear power plants. France couldn't do new nuclear power plants. From Kazakhstan, we are getting uranium. That would not have been accessible. So it ended India's nuclear apartheid. And then we were able to access what we needed from other partners also. But what it enabled in the US, that even if they couldn't do civil nuclear technology related cooperation, they were able to do higher level technology cooperation in other areas. So, for example, if you look at defense, till 2008, we hardly bought any defense supplies from the US. By now, we have contracted to buy more than $20 billion of defense supplies from the US, and an additional $3 billion for drones is in the process of being placed. And we are now talking of a defense technology cooperation, which was unthinkable before that. Now, once President Bush's term ended, we had Democrat President Obama coming in, and there was concern about how he would deal with the relationship, because as a senator, he had moved amendments in the Senate because he was opposed to the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement. He had moved amendments in the Senate which would have effectively killed the agreement. But then, of course, the agreement eventually passed and he voted for the agreement. But once he came in, the message we got was that he saw the nuclear agreement as settled law, and the administration would work on the basis of that. Also, in October 2008, while the election campaign was still on, he had given an interview to Time magazine where he said that if elected, he would appoint a special envoy to deal with the Kashmir issue. Now, as you know, India's firm position is that we do not accept any third party role in the Kashmir issue. And I think once his administration came in, they realized India's firm position on this. And so they made it clear that they would not appoint any kind of a special envoy or anything to deal with the Kashmir issue. And when he appointed a special envoy, Richard Holbrooke, to deal with the Afghanistan-Pakistan issue, he deliberately kept India or Kashmir out of the ambit of Richard Holbrooke. Now, President Obama also advanced the relationship significantly. He invited our Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, as the first state visitor of the Obama administration. Now, that was a deliberate signal. We are talking about our Prime Minister having just gone on a state visit. And he has been only the third state-level visitor of the Biden administration in 2.5 years of the Biden administration. So that's a signal. But President Obama deliberately selected India to come for a state visit. And they do state visits very, very infrequently. And then he himself came to India on a visit in 2010, declared support for India's permanent membership of UN Security Council. In 2015, he came to India on a Republic Day as a chief guest, the first US president historically to have come to India on a Republic Day. And then in 2016, he declared India a major defense partner and worked with India for India's membership on major international export control regimes, such as the Wassenaar Arrangement, Australia Group, the Missile Technology Control Regime. And then after the Obama tenure, we had a Republican, President Trump, who in many ways was a maverick. He was not part of the mainstream political establishment. People were unsure how he'd deal with the India relationship. Yet a section of the Indian American community in the campaign had come forward to support him. And you may recall that in 2016, during the elections, he had recorded a video where he had said, "Ab ki baar Trump Sarkar," taking off from Prime Minister Modi's campaign in 2014 for his own election at that time. And then after becoming president, he placed India on strategic trade authorization level 1, which means technology releases at the same level as NATO partners and closest allies of the US. And you may remember that in 2019, he joined the Indian Prime Minister for a rally of 50,000 Indian Americans in Houston. And it's very unusual.
I was there at that rally to cover that.
Absolutely. So you would have seen the mood there, the atmosphere there. And it is very unusual for a US president to join for a rally for a visiting foreign leader. And not only did he visit, he made a speech, and he stayed right through the event. So yeah, very unusual signaling. And I think certainly he was, aside from his support for the Prime Minister for India, he was looking at his own constituency. He was looking at the growing strength of the Indian American voter in US elections, Indian American funding for campaigns in the US. So that was an important dimension. And then after Trump, we have had now a Democrat, President Biden. And the upward trajectory of the relationship has been sustained. The Quad of India, Japan, Australia, and the US was reactivated by President Trump in 2017, meeting first at the level of officials, then at the level of foreign ministers. Once President Biden came in, he upgraded to a level of the summit meeting. And they've had several meetings, both virtual and in person meetings. And if you see now, consistently, one of the things that keeps recurring is that the value of the partnership with India, various things, bilateral and others will come to that, but also the Quad. And in the joint statement, there is a specific reference that among the strategic convergence we have global level, regional level, and then particularly the Quad. So the Quad has become a very important element of deepening the partnership between the two countries. And then finally, in January this year, you would note that the two national security advisors launched a new initiative on critical and emerging technologies, looking at new areas of cooperation in artificial intelligence, quantum, cyber, 6G, biotech, space, semiconductors. So really in frontier technology areas, saying that we will build a partnership, it is to our mutual advantage. So it is in that framework that the Indian Prime Minister was invited on a state visit. And although Modi has gone there several times since 2014, for him this was the first state visit. Early before that was Prime Minister Manmohan Singh in 2009. But very unusually, as both Manojit and you have pointed out, he was invited to address a joint session of the US Congress for the second time. And from what I see, only 4 other leaders have historically had that opportunity. There's been Winston Churchill, and they have a particular relationship, US with the UK. There was Nelson Mandela, and then 2 Israeli prime ministers, Yitzhak Rabin and Netanyahu. So this is a reflection of the fact that there is broad bipartisan support for the India relationship. Republicans, Democrats in the House and in the Senate come together now to support the India relationships, and therefore they welcome the Prime Minister. So it is in this framework that during this visit, with all the background that has emerged in the last 2 decades, and a lot of the work that has gone on in the past few years, many significant decisions were taken in the area of defense, in the area of technology partnership, in the area of civilian economic and technology partnerships, semiconductors, which have laid the basis for future progress. So I would say, summarizing this, that the Civil Nuclear Cooperation Agreement of 2008 enabled all the developments in technology and defense partnership that happened since then. And the initiative on critical and emerging technologies that the two countries have now launched is laying the basis for further transforming the relationship and taking it to another level. And that's where we are now.
Thank you. Thank you so much for so eloquently and lucidly explaining the transformation in ties that took place a little over 2 decades. The Biden administration, once it came to power, we discussed that, we did that explained session just after the elections and before the administration took office, that it will get a fillip, it will get a off to a great start. That was the optimism that you had expressed at that point of time. While that did happen, but there was a blip on the radar where the US ambassador to India's position was left vacant for almost more than 2 years. And that, in a sense, caused some bit of discomfort that or concern that possibly Biden administration was not giving priority to the India relationship. How do you sort of address that concern at that point of time? Now we know that that is not true, but I mean, at that point of time, was it a valid sort of a sense you got?
No, I don't think it was a valid sense. I think at one level, of course, when an ambassador is not there, then the embassy is not headed by somebody who's seen as having a particular mandate, particular profile, the kind of access that one would normally expect, both in the system here and also in the system in the US. But it was not a reflection of any lack of attention from the US administration or the President Biden himself for the India relationship. Because, in fact, the person that President Biden had nominated as his choice to be the ambassador was somebody who was believed and seen to be very close to him politically. Somebody who was co-chair of the Biden campaign in 2020, and therefore an important person. Therefore, having direct access to the White House, direct access to President Biden, which is important. But in the US system, as you know, in India, once the government decides on who the ambassador would be, then you take the approval of the country to which the ambassador is to be posted, and then he's announced and he goes there. In the US system, after this process is completed of selection by the US government, then sort of an agreement being given by the country where he will be sent. After that, he has to get also an approval from the US Senate. And all senior positions in the US government have to be approved by the US Senate. And that was where the problem was. For various reasons, the US Senate was not able to bring up his candidature for approval. And that delayed the process. So many people at that time within the US suggested that perhaps President Biden should look at nominating someone else. But I think because of his own relationship with the ambassador, and then you've seen how active he is after coming here, and his own assessment of the impact he would have once he came to India, he stayed with his nomination. And that's what delayed the process. But in the interim, the US has a system of sending someone as a charge d'affaires, a senior ambassador, a retired ambassador, as a charge d'affaires, and not just the number two in the embassy becoming the charge d'affaires always. And they sent a couple of people in the interim to function here as charge d'affaires who had influence in the system there, who had access here. But of course, an ambassador is an ambassador. So now the issue is resolved. He's here. And from what I see, in terms of what he's doing, meetings he's having, places he's visiting, he's certainly very, very
active. Right. Ambassador Singh, Singh, you've dealt with this relationship and you explained the importance of technology and the technology denial regime that was there, which was completely loaded against India. Now, the defense deal in this particular visit are really have been one of the major highlights of this particular visit, especially the GE jet engine deal, which where there is a clause for at least that's what we saw in the joint statement, a provision for technology transfer. Now, if you could explain to us how significant, how important is this technology transfer in a jet engine deal, and what does this mean for the other sectors as well?
No, Shubhajit, is certainly very, very significant. You'd recall that way back in 2013-14, the US had started something called the Defense Trade and Technology Initiative, DTTI, where India and the US started for the first time discussion on getting higher level technologies or high level technology partnership in the area of defense. That did not progress very well. And really critical technologies were not forthcoming. But where they could partner was in lower level technologies. And when I watched that process closely, and I had been assigned there for parts of that time, I could see that part of the problem was that the two systems did not have experience of talking to each other in terms of defense technology partnership. This was the first time they were doing it. So, and there was therefore a lack of proper understanding on both sides of what could be done and how to go about doing it. In the US particularly, there are two main entities involved in any defense technology transfer. One is, of course, the US government, which has to authorize that transfer. Second, the private company, because technology is held in the private company. So the US government has to say that from the perspective of their national security consideration, they're ready to allow the transfer. And the company has to say that it is in their commercial interest to do that kind of a transfer. And therefore, one of the things that came up at that time was transfer of technology for jet engines. And the US government assessment then was that from the national security perspective, they were not ready to permit a transfer of jet engine technology.
Which year was this?
This was about 2014. Okay. And so that didn't happen. It was a different engine, but broadly, similar issues came up. Now, since then, there have been a lot of developments in the India-US relationship, including in defense. In other areas, of course, there. Now, for example, in 2016, as I mentioned, uh, India and the US declared India a major defense partner. Through that provision, India could get access to some higher levels of technology in defense. In 2018, India and the US signed what was called COMCASA, Communication Compatibility and Security Agreement. So that certain kinds of equipment could now there could be partnership related to that, supplies, maybe even technology partnership. Then in 2020, India and the US signed something called BECA, Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement, allowing for sharing of geospatial information. And that all this is enhancing greater confidence in the relationship. And finally, as I mentioned, in January this year, they launched this initiative on critical and emerging technologies. Now, if you go back and see the fact sheet that was put out by the White House after this meeting on 31st January this year, there's a very specific reference there that the US government would expedite the processing of the proposal for transfer of jet engine technology to India. So now, obviously, by now, the companies involved, HAL on the Indian side, GE on the US side, saw that commercially this was something they could look at. And now the role of the US government comes in. And through ISET, where they're signaling that we are now ready to move to higher level of technology partnership, it was a signal that we are now willing to consider jet engine technology. So flowing from that and subsequent discussion, that transfer has now been authorized. And it is very, very significant. This kind of transfer that they are talking about, they say something they have never done before. And therefore, it's a signal, of course, as far as the relationship is concerned. But it is also a signal globally to other players in the global context that the US sees the relationship with India in a new framework, at a new level of technology partnership. And of course, from India's perspective, getting transfer of technology and doing co-production of the engine in India is certainly for our defense industry. And we talk about building our defense industrial capacity, also self-reliance in many areas of defense technologies. It's a major development.
Yeah. I mean, you rightly pointed out, defense relationship or technology relationship actually happens only when there is a growth of strategic trust. There's increased strategic trust.
In fact, here, Shubhajit, I just wanted to quote to you what the Prime Minister said in one of his public comments in the US. And he said, the close defense cooperation between India and America symbolizes mutual trust and shared strategic priority. So that's, supporting exactly what you've been pointing out.
Absolutely. And, one of the reasons for this increased strategic trust is the strategic glue called, China. And its assertiveness in the region, its belligerence in the region, its aggression in Indo-Pacific, elsewhere in India's border. And, if you remember in 98, after the nuclear test, Prime Minister Vajpayee, in his letter to President Clinton, had mentioned that China was the reason why India conducted those tests, because it had a nuclear power next door. So I think from that time, the relationship really has evolved over 2 decades, where the two sides really see China as a strategic threat, as a rival, as a systemic rival, as the Trump administration had pointed out. I want you to sort of, since you were there since 2008 to 13, and then again you went back 2015, 16, you've seen this, China's rise, China's, sort of its ambition that at the global stage, and how it has violated the global rules-based order, and how US and India have come together over a period of time to, to sort of see that this international rules-based order is kept intact and it's respected. If you could take us through this journey vis-a-vis China, how has the relationship evolved?
So, Shubhajit, I would say that what is deepening the US-India relationship today is partly China. And that's not the only thing. But what is also deepening it is the strength in the bilateral relationship. But since you asked about China, let me first deal with the China question. And then later we can discuss what are the specific dimensions of strengths in the bilateral relationship: economic, technological, investments, diaspora, students. And that's the primary force behind the deepening of the partnership. And of course, the China aspect becomes a supplementary force, perhaps a catalyst in some instances. But as far as China is concerned, and again, you're right, it's something that has been evolving. As you know, till 1971, the US did not have any relationship with the People's Republic of China, Communist China. And they did the opening to China in 1971, and 1978, 79, they established diplomatic relations. After that, for a long time, the entire effort in the US was to integrate China into the international mainstream, economically, politically. And they believe that if you integrated China into the international mainstream, it will work well for the US in the geopolitical context, in the broader global rivalry that the US then had with the Soviet Union. China would be more with the US, and that will work in terms of balance of power far better for the US. But also that it would lead to political and economic liberalization in China. So that was the message that had been put out. Till President Clinton, in his various comments, he spoke about China being a strategic partner for the US. It is the Clinton administration that brought China into the WTO. Again, part of this mainstreaming of China. But in the election campaign in 2000, President Bush, for the first time, started talking of China as a strategic competitor and not
Strategic?
a partner. Competitor.
Competitor, okay.
And not a partner. And one of the reasons why they also wanted to deepen the partnership with India was that they began to see China as a challenge. These are the first stirrings of seeing China as a challenge, and therefore the need to improve the relationship with India, the process that had been started under President Clinton. Now, of course, the Bush administration was heavily preoccupied with what they were doing in Afghanistan after 9/11, and then their intervention in Iraq in 2003. When the Obama administration came in, their approach to China went through various phases. In the beginning, they spoke for the first couple of years of strategic reassurance to China that US is ready to accommodate China's legitimate interests and concerns within the global framework, and that's how they would work. You may recall that in 2009, President Obama visited China before he had invited the Indian Prime Minister for the state visit, which happened, I think, a month or so later. During that visit, they issued a joint statement where they spoke of US and China working together in South Asia. Now, that was something similar to what US and China had issued in 1998 after our nuclear test. So this phrase in the joint statement caused a lot of concern in India. That what are you signaling? That after all the changes that are happening, after whatever progress has been made with the nuclear deal, are you saying that US and China will work together in South Asia? And India's concerns were conveyed very clearly to the US administration. And I think the impact of that has been that from that time till now, there is no such formulation in any US-China joint statement. And they've understood. The US has understood where India stands on this. But after some time, the Obama administration moved away from the issue of strategic reassurance and started talking of a pivot to Asia. That they will now focus more on Asia because the challenge from China is growing. China is becoming more assertive, more unilateral in its approach. Then some in administration said that pivot is too strong a word. You don't want to signal China as a rival. We more that competition is coming in. So they started using the term rebalance. They will do a rebalance. But even that they could not do adequately because their concerns in Europe continued and got heightened in 2014 when Russia took action in Ukraine and took over Crimea, and then certain parts of eastern Ukraine came under local people who were supported by Russia. And also in West Asia, the US engagement because of instability there continued. Even the rebalance they could not carry out. And as a result, if you remember in 2015, when China militarized features in the South China Sea, in violation of international norms, in violation of ruling of the International Tribunal, in violation of the United Nations Convention of the Sea, the US did not come up with any firm response. And all they said was that we will just do freedom of navigation operations. So after the Obama administration, the Trump administration came in for the first time with a very decisive posture related to China. And in the national security strategy adopted by the Trump administration in 2017, then the national defense strategy in 2018, for the first time, China is mentioned as a rival, as a revisionist power that the US needs to deal with. Part of the reason, of course, was that for his own election campaign, Trump drew heavily on the votes of the middle 40 to 50% of US population, which had lost its jobs and saw its income stagnate, death rates go up, longevity came down because of the siphoning of jobs to China. So electorally, it helped Trump to take a very strong posture against China. But there again, if you remember, in June 2019, if I remember right, in a meeting with Xi Jinping, at the margin of a G20 meeting, he told him, why don't you buy more from the Midwest states in the US? Because that will help me politically. So he was, doing his own maneuvering. But after Trump administration, when the Biden administration has come in the beginning, they felt that they needed to continue the very tough line on China to prevent Trump from consolidating his voter base. So that's how they came in. And again, they see the strategic challenge from China. And therefore, they have done more technology restrictions on China than the Trump administration had done. But they are finding that many of their allies and partners are not quite on the same wavelength as far as the China challenge is concerned, especially the European partners, Germany, France, whose economies have been impacted by Russia's action in Ukraine and the consequences of that, don't want any disruption at the moment in their trade and economic relationship with China. The Southeast Asian countries have said publicly they don't want to be forced to choose between US and China. So keeping that in mind, the US has somewhat moderated its stance on China and said that we are not looking at decoupling. We are looking at de-risking the relationship, and that US companies should have options other than China so that the supply chain is not concentrated on China. But at the same time, they are not loosening the technology restrictions. And they have said that high technologies where they see a national security interest, they will deny access to those technologies to China. And they're working on a new measure for the first time to prevent US companies from investing in China in high technology areas. So that's something under consideration. So although there's been some softening, and they say that they want to also have regular communication with China so that competition does not veer into conflict, I think the basic element of competition in the US-China relationship will be sustained for some time because really they are now competing for global leadership.
Right. The other country actually, which also comes across now in discussion between India and US is Russia. India's sort of overwhelming dependence for defense supplies on Russia. And in the backdrop of the Russian war on Ukraine, Russian invasion of Ukraine, there have been differences between India and the US on the Russia question, and that has also been part of the conversations, public statements over the last year and a half, that since the conflict in Ukraine began. Now, I wanted you to tell us, from India-US perspective, is it a stress test that India-US relations is being subjected to because of the Russia issue, Russia-Ukraine war? And will it be able to withstand, because India is locked in a situation where the dependence for its defense needs is very, very critical, especially when you have 50 to 60,000 troops, Chinese troops on the India-China border. And in that kind of situation, what does the India-Russia relationship, how does it impact the India-US relationship?
So, Shubhajit, if it were a stress test, I would say both countries have passed the test very, very well. From the US perspective, of course, they would like their friends, partners, allies to go along with the US position and how they would like to define a particular crisis that is brewing. And they have seen that India has not fully accepted the US position. India has not criticized Russia. India has not condemned Russia. India has not voted against Russia at the UN for reasons that you mentioned. We have a strong defense partnership. We have a legacy relationship. Russia has been politically supportive of us at a time when we were under pressure from the West, including the US. But the message from the US consistently is that they understand India's compulsion related to Russia. And the US National Security, the Secretary of State has said on many occasions that India's relationship with Russia developed at a time when the US was not willing to be that kind of a partner. And so we understand it. And now saying that, yes, now we are willing to be that kind of a partner. Or the National Security Advisor has said that with India, we're playing the long game, and therefore understanding India's compulsion. So India stood by its position, its own assessment, took a position based on its own national security interests. And the US has shown understanding for India's position and compulsion. And so I would say certainly they have passed the stress test. And if you see the joint statement, there is a paragraph on Ukraine, a fairly detailed paragraph on Ukraine, where they've spoken about where they have a convergence, dealing with the humanitarian situation, the economic impact of the crisis, the need for Ukraine's reconstruction post-conflict, and the fact that that's a position that India has taken consistently, that they support the sovereignty and territorial integrity of countries. Now, that clearly India has taken a position based on its own interest and how it sees the norms in international relations, which would be seen in a veiled way as a criticism of what Russia has done, because Russia has moved into the eastern part of Ukraine. So I think both have handled that well, and US is watching closely as to what happens to Russia as this conflict evolves, what happens to the Russia-China relationship as this conflict evolves, and therefore what will be the impact of the Russia-India relationship going ahead, and if there will be more opportunity for the US as a result of that.
Right. So diversification as a strategy would benefit, obviously, US amongst other strategic partners as well. And
no, absolutely. I mean, and they would like to use the current moment, even if they have disagreement with India's position, the current moment to see if they can use it to deepen the partnership with India further. And as far as India is concerned, again, India has to, as I see it in a longer term framework, certainly deepen partnership with the US, sustain the relationship with Russia, and strengthen itself to deal with the challenge from China. I mean, that's what India has to handle in the current phase of intense global multipolar contestation that is playing out.
Right. We have a lot of questions on the chat box, and before I move to the chat box, I want to just ask a couple of questions and then ask for audience questions. The other, you talked about eloquently about the dehyphenation that happened, India and Pakistan, that US did. In the last 20 years or so, we have seen, during the terror attacks or during the last joint statement, US has been really taken a very, very strong, robust stance against terrorism. And counterterrorism, security cooperation is one of the key pillars of the relationship. Uh, where does and US after exiting Afghanistan, and you've handled Afghanistan, Pakistan as well in the MEA back in the day, and this exit from Afghanistan, Pakistan's sort of politics, the turmoil that it is in right now, where do India and US stand when it comes to Pakistan, seeing Pakistan as a problem in the region, or really as Hillary Clinton's famous comment, snakes in the backyard, or Madeleine Albright saying it's a migraine, global migraine. Do you think the India-US relationship has finally found a common position, or there are still challenges because US still supplies F-16 or services them, whereas India feels that is again double standards on part of US when it comes to relationship with India?
So, Shubhajit, as we were discussing, every country takes decisions or exercises choices in international relations based on its own interests and perspectives. Now, Pakistan will be a country where there will have convergence with the US and some divergence with the US. Clearly, where we stand today, US sees India as a far more important partnership. When you're talking of the most consequential partnership, as the US says, defining partnership of the 21st century. No, that's not the kind of language they use with Pakistan. But at the same time, they feel that they need to have some access to the Pakistani leadership. And I find today that's for two main reasons. One, Pakistan is a nuclear weapon country. And therefore, they feel they need to have some way of accessing Pakistani leadership, having a conversation with them, so that any potential challenges related to nuclear weapons and other things they can talk about. So that's one reason. Second, as we all know, the AFPAC region has been a hotbed of terrorism and support to terrorism. And therefore, for counter-terrorism cooperation, for any terrorism emanating from that may be impacting on US interests, they want to be able to access the Pakistani leadership. Today, for example, the US, after withdrawing from Afghanistan in 2021, wants to do a counter-terrorism related surveillance over Afghanistan and send its drones there. And for that, they have to go over Pakistani territory. So they need to talk to the Pakistani leadership and Pakistani army and have that access. So that's a dimension. Therefore, from time to time, they take certain decisions related to Pakistan that we are not always comfortable with. I recall way back in 2016, when I was ambassador there, the Obama administration suddenly decided to supply 18 F-16 aircraft to Pakistan at a time when the relations with Pakistan were difficult. In 2011, Osama bin Laden had been found in Pakistan. A year later, US troops operating along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border had killed 24 Pakistani soldiers, and Pakistan had stopped US supplies from going through Pakistan into Afghanistan. And so logistically a challenge for the US at that time. But still they did that in 2016. And the reason for it was that the administration wanted to see if they can get some kind of a dialogue going with the Taliban to lead to subsequently a political settlement. And they felt that Pakistan is the only country that could have helped them get a dialogue going with the Pakistan. So they offer 18 F-16. And then we decided to lobby against that agreement. So we very actively lobbied the US Congress. And it shows to you the increasing institutional, stakeholders in the US-India relationship. US Congress blocked that deal. And therefore the supply couldn't go through. Now, in the Biden administration, they have now offered a $450 million sustainment package for the F-16s with Pakistan. So no new F-16s are being provided. They say they're not upgrading the F-16, they're just allowing sustainment of what Pakistan has. So that's their justification. That, once you've supplied a platform, you must do sustainment. But from India's perspective, who does Pakistan use F-16s against? India. So it's a negative development. So certainly, if we expect that US must accept and understand when we take positions in issues such as Ukraine, based on our interests, which may be different from the US position, then on occasion, US will also take decisions on issues where it will not fully be in harmony with our position. But ultimately, both have to look at the overall relationship and do a balance, of the cost benefit and how it is playing out. So that's where the Pakistan relationship is. The India relationship is far deeper. US is far more consequential, but they will maintain some relationship with Pakistan, keeping in mind their interests, and we will not always be very comfortable with that.
My final question before I move to audience questions is, on this issue of democracy and human rights, this has always been a sort of a topic of discussion between the two sides. I mean, it's much to discomfiture of the Indian government here. Indian establishment has always sort of rejected some of those comments. And in the latest episode, while the visit was on, while we saw, responding to questions, President Biden, he defended almost the Indian democracy, or I mean, he said that he respected sort of India and have had those conversations with Indian leadership on human rights issues. But former President Obama's comments to in an interview has caused a lot of stir here. And we have seen Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman, Defense Minister Rajnath Singh coming out and sort of rebutting those comments, refuting those statements, but no statement yet from the government, at least so far, from the Ministry of External Affairs so far. So, how do you see this as a challenge when this is a fault line, this is a challenge, this is a theme which is sensitive to the Indian government here? I mean, how do you see the two sides negotiating this challenge?
So, Shubhajit, all societies have problems. All societies have challenges. If you look at the US, look at the challenge of racism in the US. Look at the challenge related to voter suppression in the US, where so that the minority groups specific measures are taken so that they find it difficult to get to be able to vote. You look at the challenges related to redistricting of voting constituencies so that they favor one party or the other. And then you saw what happened on January 6, 2021, when the US Capitol was stormed to prevent orderly transfer of power. So US has its own challenges. At the same time, since the Second World War, despite its own challenges, US has defined its international profile as promoting democracy, human rights worldwide. And so that's how they see themselves and their role in the international context. So given that, I think the way they are handling the India relationship, and you saw it coming clearly from the administration, President Biden and others, that whatever conversation they have with India will be one among equals, and one sort of talking about common interest in strengthening democracy, human rights everywhere. And so that's how they've approached it. And I think that's, from an analytical and professional point of view, a far better way to address the issue. But then in a democratic structure like the US, despite its challenges and flaws, different people will have different viewpoints. And that's things that you deal with.
Fantastic. So let me move to the questions from the audience. I would like to call Zakir Hussain as the caller. Mr. Hussain, if you could ask a question.
Hello. Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, Mr.
Yeah,
Hussain,
we can hear you.
please go ahead.
Okay, so question this is a very important just concluded the honorable Prime Minister's visit to the United States as a state guest, I have got one very important questions, and that is for the United States of America. Is it just an opportunistic liberty to have an eye on the dragon? The dragon, when I talk about China actually, or to have an eye on the dragon, or is it a real time commitment by two of the world's biggest democracies?
Right. Thank you.
So,
And
Shubhajit, here, if I could go back to one point that I had referred to, that is there is a lot of strength in the bilateral relationship today. Our trade with the US is $191 billion. It has increased more than 12 or 13 times in the last 2 decades. US companies have invested $54 billion in the Indian economy. Indian companies, and which is something that people are not really familiar with, have invested more than $40 billion in the US economy and have presence across all 50 states. You saw that Air India, for example, is going to buy 200 planes from Boeing. And as the US administration and the Prime Minister referred to, President Biden also said, that is going to create 1 million new jobs in the US across 44 states in the US. And it is for that reason that if you look at the joint statement that was issued after this visit, there are references to US investment in India, but there are also specific references to 3 Indian investments in the US, done by a new investment by Indian companies going to be done in renewable energy, in steel, and in components for batteries for electric vehicles. So it's a relationship now that is working to the advantage of both. India certainly sees some advantages from the US in technology partnerships, but US companies gain a lot in terms of partnership with India. Many of the leading US companies who are doing cutting-edge design technology work in semiconductors, in jet engines, employ 5,000, 8,000, 10,000 people in India doing that technology work for them. Of course, the IP is with the US company and Indians are involved, but they need partnership with the human tech capital of India. When I was ambassador in the US, I visited Silicon Valley several times. And I could see that Indian origin tech workers, Indian origin tech entrepreneurs, Indian origin CEOs were an integral part of US leadership in innovation globally, including in digital technologies. So this is a partnership. And then if you saw, for example, in Prime Minister's address to the joint session, he mentioned that when aerospace and defense grows in India, he listed out what's happening in several states in the US, or that when the US companies grows, what's happening in terms of research and development in India. So it's a partnership that is really working for both. And then now, we have more than 200,000 Indian students in US universities, building networks for the future to enhance the economic and other areas of partnership. And you look at the Indian origin diaspora, more than 4 million strong, a very strong presence in the administration, in Congress, in business. So it's a very deep link between the two societies. And in fact, on several occasions, in various comments made by spokesmen and also in the joint statement, there's a reference to extremely warm and friendly relations at the people-to-people level. So there is a deep linkage also at the people-to-people level, which is providing a basis for building the relationship. So I would say that the real ballast for the relationship is provided by these strong elements of the bilateral partnership. The China aspect is a supplemental aspect. Some areas it becomes a catalyst for expediting certain kinds of approval, but the main thrust is from the strengths of the bilateral relationship.
Right. Yeah, I think Dr. Manmohan Singh, I think had said that almost every family in India, in the middle class and upper middle class, in the middle class, India has at least one person who they know or who is there in the United States, either studying or working or living there. And that kind of bridge between the two sides, in terms of people-to-people connect, is a really formidable kind of relationship.
And then President Biden said on a couple of occasions, and it's also there in the joint statement, that no aspect of human enterprise has been left untouched by their relationship. So reflecting the deep partnership that is there now.
From seas to stars is how.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. So the next question is from Priyadarshini Karan. If you could ask your question, Priyadarshini Karan, unmute yourself and ask the question, please.
Yes, good evening. My name is Priyadarshini. I'm from Plutus IS. I'm representing Plutus IS today. So my question for you, sir, is that do you think India's inclination towards US as a defense partner can defy its authority of geopolitics, especially considering its geographical proximity to China and Russia?
So, Priyadarshini, as I understand your question is that if India builds a stronger defense partnership with the US, will it still maintain the autonomy of its decision making? Having dealt with Indian diplomacy for several decades, and now for several years watching Indian diplomacy from the outside as to how it is, exercising its choices. One cardinal element in Indian foreign policy is to maintain the strategic autonomy of its decision making. And you've seen that play out also in the context of Russia and Ukraine. And I believe that at the level of the popular support, the moment there is a sense that India is not taking decisions in its own interest or is dictated by any other country, there'll be tremendous opposition to that relationship. That's why I believe that even as we strengthen our partnership with the US across different domains, including defense, and in defense, a very important element of the thrust is to maintain our own capacities, to build our own capacities for defense manufacturing and production. So I think India will certainly, right through, exercise its own choices. And where there is convergence, you work with other countries, like in the Indo-Pacific today, for example. India sees a convergence with the US. And the Indian government and the Prime Minister have said on a number of occasions that they see the Quad as a force for global good, which is the partnership with Australia, Japan, US, and India. And again, I think another reflection of where some of the convergences and strengths in the India-US relationship is that not just the Quad in the Indo-Pacific, but there's a new grouping of India, US, Israel, and UAE, the I2U2, where they're working together in terms of looking at food security, renewable energy, building communication capabilities in West Asia. And again, showing convergence. Another example is that towards the end of first week of May, the national security advisors of India, US, UAE, and Saudi Arabia had a meeting in Saudi Arabia. So you build based on convergence, but you maintain the capacity for your own decision making.
Right. Next question is from Madhushri Das. If you could unmute yourself and ask the question, Madhushri Das.
Please on unmute. Ms. Das, please ask the question. Let's move to the next person.
Yeah. So the next question is from Milan Mehta. Milan Mehta, if you could unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yeah, namaskar, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, you are audible.
Yeah, sir, already my queries have been answered partly by Arun ji and also excellent query by Shubhajit ji when he asked about the Indo-Russian relationship, how it will affect, our Indo-US ties. So I'll come to a pertinent question which is right now cropped up 2 days back when our Defense Minister Rajnath Singh said we can take POK anytime we want. What do you think will be the stance of US and China looking to the present situation if India does this adventure?
No, I don't think we should speculate on issues. Well, I think best is to handle issues as they arise.
Thank you.
Okay, sir. Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Next question is from Amit Gupta. Amit Gupta.
Yeah, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Arun sir, for giving such a beautiful perspective on such a complex issue in such a lucid manner. So, I am a social entrepreneur working in the field of technical vocational education, generally working with youth on their sustainable livelihood creation. You see, over last 3 decades, I think it has been IT which has seen a lot of migration of people from India to US, and what we could see from Mr. Biden that he was there was a lot of emphasis on local manufacturing getting created in US on all of those aspects. So, out of your experience, I wanted to see take some guidance where you see an opportunity for our skilled workforce, not the IT, generally blue collared space that we talk about in the US, sir. Do you see some opportunity for them? Because we are talking about making India a skill capital of the world, where we are wanting to send this youth, no doubt trained youth, to countries. So,
So I would say for the what you refer to as the blue collar worker, perhaps the best opportunity would arise in terms of enhanced investments in India, including foreign investments in India. And again, through the various cooperation measures that are being worked out, there is a sense that there will be more investment forthcoming in India, including from the US, aside from whatever investment is generated locally. And that will add to opportunities for them. Now, some countries globally, and I don't see that happening at the moment in the US, where there is a tremendous shortage of workforce, they do bring in workers in manufacturing in other areas on shorter term visas. And then there is, of course, a rotation. So it's a balance whether it is a better strategy to create more jobs locally at home, because once at home, when you create certain number of jobs, including through foreign investment, then there is a multiplier effect on further job creation, second order effect following from the direct job creation. But if the job creation happening outside India, then the multiplier effect happens in that society, not in India. So, in the India-US context, for example, a lot of people said whether there would be a conflict between America first and Atmanirbhar Bharat. Because, so how do you reconcile those? And the message that you see coming out of the visit, including in the joint statement, is that Atmanirbhar Bharat and America first, at least in the India-US relationship, can coexist in a mutually supportive way. Enhanced capacity in the US will lead to job creation in India. More jobs created in India will also create opportunities for US businesses. And based on that, they talk about global value chain, you hear talk about resilient supply chains. And what India is trying to do is plug itself into the resilient and secure supply chain frameworks that are now being worked upon after the phase of globalization has effectively come to an end.
Right. Mr. Singh, there's a question from Mr. Ashok K. Kanta. He asks at the chat box, are we discussing between India and the US at track 1 and track 2 levels, management of expectations from each other in conflict situations along the India-China borders or in the Indo-Pacific, say in the Taiwan Strait? How candid and realistic this dialogue is, Mr. Singh?
So my sense, and I may not have a full 360-degree view on this, is my sense is that at the track 2 level, I don't think there is an intense discussion on this very focused aspect of what happens in a conflict situation, at least at the track 2 level. And what could be happening deep inside track 1 levels, we would not know now. But I think there is at the track 2 levels certainly more and more discussion about what is the China challenge, where is it headed, how do countries respond to that. And from various public statements or declassified conversations that have come out in the public domain, it is clear that at the track 1 level, there is intense discussion related broadly to the challenge from China.
Next question is from Mr. Narayan Kumar. Mr. Kumar, if you could unmute yourself and ask the question.
Good evening, Ambassador. Good evening, Shubhajit.
Good evening.
My question is twofold, Mr. Ambassador. Isn't this transformation in Indo-US ties directly a result of China's not so peaceful rise and a potential threat that is being posed to the literal states of the Indo-Pacific region? And secondly, isn't this transformation also a result of Russian revanchism that has taken place in the last few years? And the second question, Mr. Ambassador, is this. Does the US need India more because of the regional geopolitical compulsions that have occurred? Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you. So I think perhaps we address partly one segment of your question, that the challenge that this US sees from China is certainly a catalyst, certainly one of the factors, but not the main factor in consolidating the India-US relationship. The main factor in consolidating the India-US relationship is the opportunities seen in the bilateral context. You know, the Indian economy is already the 5th largest economy globally. It has been said that by end of the decade, it will be the 3rd largest economy globally. So even if China were not there as a factor, then the US and India would benefit by doing more and more together with each other. There'll be enhanced opportunity, including for technology partnerships. But with the China factor, an additional element has come in. And today, for example, the US has said that while it sees Russia as an immediate challenge to security in Europe, but in a longer term framework, it sees China as its main economic, technological, and military rival. It sees China as the only country in the international system with the intent and capability of wanting to replace the US in the international system. And therefore, they are entering into a phase of deep competition. Now, in the cutting edge technology areas that we referred to, which will define leadership in the global context in the coming period, in many of them, China is competitive. In some of them, China is ahead. Therefore, for the US to remain ahead or to remain globally competitive in some of those areas, when it is competing with a country with a population of 1.4 billion, it needs a partnership with a country like India, which has strength in tech skills, and a country of 1.4 billion. So if you're looking at generating data, if you're looking at scaling up effort in certain areas, the partnership with India will be useful also to the US beyond just defense-related cooperation. So, and again, this partnership that the US has started looking at with India, as I described earlier, started way back in 2000. And in 2000, US did not have such a difficult relationship with Russia. So the effort on India is not driven by whatever may be their challenges related to Russia. Certainly, China is an element of how they are defining their strategies. In fact, in 2021, there was a commission that had come out with a report on artificial intelligence, which had been set up under Trump administration, led by Eric Schmidt and others. And in that report, they say that India will be a very important for US as a partner, for US to maintain its technological leadership in the global context. So yes, I think it's the bilateral, it's the China challenge. Russia, how it plays out, we'll have to see. But originally, that was not the driving force.
Yeah, I think we've just run out of time. So I've just closed by taking the last question. Mr. Satwik C. Mr. Satwik. Satwik, if you could unmute yourself and ask the question, please.
Satvik is not there. Suhas Pulikar.
Okay. I think. Hello.
Yeah, can we call Suhas?
Yeah, Suhas Pulikar. I think he's also not there. So I would just close, and but before that, there was an interesting question, and we didn't address West Asia and Iran at all during our conversation. So there's a question from Mr. Amar Tyagi, who says, how do we see India-US relations in West Asia in the context of revival of talks with Iran?
So no, look, as far as India is concerned, it has very strong relations with different players in West Asia. We have very strong relationship with Israel, a very strong defense partnership, very strong technology partnership. Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, very important energy partners, also investment partners. And we have the I2U2 arrangement. We also, as I mentioned, had a meeting of the National Security Advisors with the select group of countries. And Iran is an important partner for India. For us to have access to Afghanistan, the only route we can take is through Iran. Because Pakistan doesn't allow a supply of Indian goods from India through Pakistan to Afghanistan. So for humanitarian assistance and the other things that we did. And I remember way back in 2001, when the Taliban had been driven out at that time from Kabul, and India moved quickly to establish its embassy in Kabul at that time. The only way we could do that was flying over Iran and getting into Afghanistan, because Pakistan would not allow us. So Iran again is a very, very important partner, and with Iran, India is working on the North-South corridor, which would cut time for supplies from India through Iran, through the Caspian to Russia. So there are many advantages also in the Iran relationship. So India's effort certainly would be, and then we have 8 million people, Indian origin people in the Gulf, and their remittances of $35 to $40 billion annually are very important component in terms of balancing out the trade deficit that we have. So we would certainly like stability in the Gulf. We would certainly like countries there being able to work in a cooperative and harmonious way. So anything that leads to that direction is certainly that India would support.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Singh. That was indeed a fascinating and insightful conversation. We really got a sense of the transformation of the relationship, where it is poised right now, and the challenges ahead. Thank you so much for analyzing the developments with your unparalleled depth and breadth of experience, and explaining the issues to our readers and viewers in a very easy to understand manner. I'll just, now go to Monojit, my colleague, to close the session.
I mean, thank you, Ambassador Singh. I mean, that was wonderful as always. I'm sorry for myself, and I hope you'll forgive me that I could not listen to all of you said. I mean, we have an edition tonight, and I had to keep running off to look at that too. But I do feel secure that we have a video of this conversation, and I'm going to get back to it as soon as I can. And for all of you in the audience, the recording will be up on the YouTube channel of the Indian Express very shortly. And all of you, please go back to it, keep it, share it widely among your friends, family, contacts. I'm sure whatever Ambassador Singh has said is going to have lasting relevance. And as we keep on understanding, as the contours of this relationship unfold, there are things which I'm sure you'd like to go back to. Thank you, Ambassador Singh, again. And thank you, Shubho, for helming this conversation so well, as always. Thank you to our partner, Plutus IAS. And to each one of you who tuned in. I mean, I have 58 open questions still, and I have about 7 hands up. So my apologies to everyone. Okay, 4 more. Okay, I do wish I could have given everybody a chance, but that would be being too harsh on the kindness of Ambassador Singh. Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you, sir. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Balajit. Thanks, Shubhajit.
Thank you.
Plutus
Plutus IS, our features are live interactive classes, limited batch size, well qualified and experienced faculties, doubt removal sessions, current affair classes, study material and test series, mentorship program, mock interviews. To know more, contact us at 844-844-0231 or visit our website www.plutusis.com. Plutus IS, our features are live interactive classes, limited